All right, government students, welcome to our screencast on the philosophers. And just a few things before we start. When you listen to these, one of the things you should do is, obviously listen and then pause when you need to, and also take notes. If that helps you, this is stuff that we've already gone over in class, so this should be mostly a review for you. And then secondly, the whole goal at the end of it is that you'll understand the key influences on our revolutionary ideas, the political thinkers and ideas that led towards our revolution. So let's get started. At the beginning of this, I asked you to think about our cafeteria and imagine that there were no longer any supervisors. Right? We call this a state of nature. If there are no rules or laws for people to follow, how would they behave? Some of you seem to think that there would be total anarchy, right? People running to the cafeteria to get food as fast as they can, stealing food, food fights, and in general chaos. And others think that it might be fine. People would behave normally and do as they should do. The way you view this perspective of what would life be like in our natural state is a really, really important idea in terms of what kind of government you think we should have. So that's a good place to start when we look at these ideas. And the big question we're going to get at today, as I said earlier, is understanding what ideas helped our founders create the United States. So we got to go way, way back to ancient Greece to see and find the first democracy in the history of the world. Right? And by democracy, we mean demo means people, crassy means power. We mean power to the people. So ancient Greece was a small community in Athens, and it was a direct democracy where every land-owning male could vote directly on all the issues. And it worked because it was a small area and people could be directly involved and understand what was going on. However, Greece falls and eventually the Roman Empire expands. And as you see on this map, it was massive. So instead of being a direct democracy, Rome established a representational democracy, otherwise known as a republic, where citizens didn't vote on the issues. They instead chose elected leaders who voted on the issues. They created this idea of a senate, right? A council of elders that were elected to make decisions. So these are both ideas of democracy that existed long before ours. We still have a council of elders. You can see we have senators who sleep on the job. And Rome eventually, just like Greece, falls. All right, it gets too big and it collapses on itself. And at this point, the lights go out in Europe, and this is the Dark Ages that we talked about, where kings rule the land. The church and the Pope are very strong. And this is a map that illustrates that. There aren't really countries as we would know today, more of territories that kings rule than an absolute monarchy. And the citizens of Europe at this time are very religious, very superstitious, and their belief in general is that God put kings on earth to rule, and the citizens had no right to question them. This is a painting that kind of illustrates the period of the Dark Ages with wars and plagues, little learning, little intellectual growth, and eventually this leads us to where the first person we're going to talk about among these five philosophers, which is Machiavelli. Remember, Machiavelli is alive towards the end of the Dark Ages. Remember, Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492. So Machiavelli is alive around the time the colonies are founded. And in the early 1500s, he's a political advisor in Italy, and he's thrown in jail when his ruling family loses power. And what he decides to do in jail is write a book called The Prince. It's a how-to guide telling a prince how they need to be a good leader. And he sneaks it out of jail, and it's published across Europe, and it's immediately banned by most kings and by the church, and it's still banned in some countries today. So I asked you to pause a moment in class and maybe do the same thing here and see if you can remember why the prince was banned, what types of things it said. Okay, welcome back. A couple things that we'll go over very quickly here that we talked about more in class. So what did the prince say? At the beginning of the book, he talks about how good kings, any good leader, needs to be merciful and faithful and humane, all these positive characteristics. But it's not really what he says. As we read these different excerpts, and you could pause if you want to read them again, but I'm not going to go over them. What we learn is that he actually is saying that good kings, need to be two-faced. They need to be a fox to be cunning and a lion to terrify people. That they cannot keep the faith. They can't keep their word, or when it could be turned against them. Instead, they should lie to people. Right? And the way they should lie to people is that they should be sneaky, right? Because people easy to fool. So basically the summarization at the bottom here is that you can act like you're trustworthy as a king, but you don't really need to be. In fact, you shouldn't be trustworthy all the time. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a good king. Be sneaky, break your word, but don't let people know that you've done that, and you can do this because people are fickle and they're easy to sway. He talks about how a wise king should choose to be feared over being loved, right? So they can control their people more easily. So all these things kind of amount to this kind of a negative view of what a king ought to do in order to be able to be a good ruler. We talked about how the Calvin and Hobbes cartoons are good illustrations of some of these political ideas. So I'll let you pause it and look over this again if you'd like. The Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson calls Prince George, the King of England, a prince, right? And basically what he's saying is you're two-faced, you're deceitful, you lie, just like what Machiavelli was talking about. So to sum up Machiavelli, he says that a good king has to act like there are all these things on the left, merciful, faithful, humane, but don't really be those things, right? Be dishonest and immoral if you need to be, whatever you need to do, because at the bottom here we say the ends justify the means, meaning whatever you need to do to keep your power, that's what you should do. So why was the prince banned? The idea is that people start to read this book and they start to question government. They start to wonder, is this how my king really acts? And instead of just blindly trusting them, they question them. Right? So this is the key contribution that Machiavelli makes. This questioning of government starts to pull us out of the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment. So our next philosopher that we'll talk about is Thomas Hobbes, who's alive in England at the beginning of the Enlightenment when people are starting to question government. He's a brilliant man. He was the royal tutor for the royal family. He was very much in close acquaintance with the king, and he wrote a book called The Leviathan. Right? And as we talked about, a Leviathan is a sea monster. So if you want to pause for a moment and again try and remind yourself why he's writing a book about politics called The Leviathan and what he was saying, go ahead and do that. Okay, welcome back. Hobbes' key question, he's the first philosopher to ask this, and we talked about at the beginning, is what is man like in his natural state? If there were no rules or laws, what would people be like? Would they be mostly good or mostly bad? And he concludes that man is naturally selfish and that we're evil. In his book, he says that without rules, humans propelled by their selfish nature would crash against each other. Right? Life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It would be a war of every man against every man. So not a very positive view about what people would be like if there was no government or rules to control them. Here's another cartoon that we talked about in class where you see this snowman who has a snow cone, and the way that he got it is by stabbing this other snowman in the back. Right? So even snowmen are naturally selfish and evil. So the idea that the natural state is bad, that we're all evil people, and the only way to stay out of that natural state is for us to have a Leviathan of a leader, a really strong king. I mentioned earlier that Hobbes is in cahoots with the king. He works for the king, and he's writing a book to argue why an absolute monarchy and with a strong and kind king is the best kind of government. Right? He says that government's a reflection of society. If government is being harsh and strong, it's only because people are misbehaving. In the cafeteria, if the cafeteria supervisors are giving you a hard time, probably the only reason is because you're misbehaving, and if you would just follow the rules, they would leave you alone. Hobbes concludes that government's the only reason that we don't have a miserable life. Right? So we owe everything to our government and have no right to question them. If we were ever to not have government, life would be totally miserable. So that's why he calls his book The Leviathan, and that's why if you see the image of the king at the top, notice that his body is made up of a bunch of small images which represent the humans that make up society, right? The people are part of the government, and they agree to it, but they have no right to question it. Locke, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of Hobbes. I showed you this picture of the two of them wrestling. He wrote also at the same time in England, but he said our natural state is a good place. We should want to go there. It was great because there's total freedom. If you remember when you were shepherds in class, we talked about our sheep herding role play. We were kind of in a natural state. There was no government overruling you. You guys had your own decisions to make. Right? Locke would say that everyone's equal, meaning no one controls anybody else. You all have rights. We have unalienable rights, he says, rights that we're naturally born with, like life, liberty, property, and I add in here pursuit of happiness because that'll come up later. Right? So if we have all these rights in our natural state so good, why would we want a government? Right? Wouldn't we just want to be on our own and have all these rights? So Locke concludes that governments exist because of this theory he calls a social contract. So I'll walk you through that real quickly. If you think of cavemen, right, with no government, right, they were living in a natural state, and they gather and they keep property. But they learn that property spoils, so eventually they come up with this idea of money, where you don't have to have property all the time. You can exchange things and trade, and people start to trade and accumulate wealth. And as people accumulate wealth and they get rich, and there's this divide in property, sometimes it creates conflict. So people decide in order to make life easier so they are not always having to protect their own property in the natural state, why don't we create a government? And this government can be the one that protects our property. And essentially, this is John Locke's social contract theory, right? Governments come, and the key part here, governments come from people. Here's a little simpler organization of that, that governments get their power from the people. And their job is then to protect the people's rights. And if government misuses that power, then the people, since they're the ones who initially created government, have the right to overthrow it. Right? This is John Locke's social contract theory, and it's what our country is strongly based on. So take a second if you want to pause and summarize Locke. Okay, now back on to the Baron de Montesquieu, who's from France and wrote just a little bit later than these two. I like to say that he agreed with Hobbes, right? He has a quote in his book that says, "Man is hungry for power." Right? He believed that people were selfish and greedy, but he also wanted Locke's ideas of democracy to a degree. So how do you have a government that is run by evil people and not have that government become evil? And his theory is that power can be used to check power. And what he meant is you can have, instead of having one government branch that does everything, you should have three. You should have a branch of government called the executive that carries out the laws, a legislative branch that writes the laws, and a judicial branch that then interprets the laws and decides justice. Right? And each of these branches can have power so that no one can get too much, and they can have checks on each other where they can control each other to some degree. Right? This is the fundamental idea of Montesquieu, and we adopt it. We have three branches of government today, and they have checks and balances that they can control each other with. Lastly, we talked about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was from Geneva, Switzerland, and he was a radical in a sense. He was alive around the time of our revolution, and his first quote in his book, The Social Contract, is that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. He's the exact opposite of Thomas Hobbes. Whereas Hobbes thought that government was good and people were bad, Rousseau would say that people are good and government is bad. Government is wrong. It's enslaving people to be naturally free. So his whole theory was almost based on the idea of direct democracy, that we need to return power to the people, right? That people have to be involved in decision making, and that they should be forced to be involved in a sense, and that government should get rid of the inequalities that enslave people so that all people can work together towards a common good. This sounds a little bit like socialism, right? Or even communism to a degree. Those ideas didn't necessarily exist yet when he was writing, but he's kind of the guy that got the ball rolling on this. He was very radical, but he was also instrumental in this desire in the colonies to have people be in charge of government and no longer a king or a ruler. He did recognize one really key thing that we're going to talk about, and we did, that governments should follow the will of the people, right, as people want through a direct democracy. But he also recognized that the will of the people is not always correct. In class, I asked you to raise your hand if you felt like one of your classmates should bring donuts next time, and almost everyone raised their hand except the person who had to bring donuts. And the point I was trying to make is that even though we democratically decided that someone was going to bring donuts, it still wasn't a very fair decision, right? The will of the people is not always right. Democracies can be just as bad as dictatorships if you let the majority trample the rights of the minority. So Rousseau pointed out that we need a strong, separate judicial branch whose job it is to make sure that decisions are fair and to protect the rights of the minority. And he concluded that if we have this government that follows the will of the people but also protects minority rights, that's the best kind of government. So if you take all of these ideas, right, of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Machiavelli, and the contributions of getting people to question their government, you smash all those together, along with the beginning ideas of democracy from the Greeks and the Romans, what you get is this tidal wave of ideas that leads to our revolution. And that's what I want you to understand this unit and for the assessment that's coming up. Let me know if you have any questions. As always, you can email me or come in and talk to me. Thanks.